most times when you are dealing with users on your application or your website, you may want to capture the user input whenever a user types in something. So in today's case, we are going to try to be capturing the number of letters a user has typed in, maybe on that name field or something like that. So what is going to happen basically is that when a user types in, we'll be capturing the user's value or the value he has typed in and try to count the number of letters in that input. And if you have ever been on Twitter, it happens when you try to tweet. Twitter captures your input and try to calculate the number of letters until some point where you can no longer add letters to that tweet, and it stops tweeting or tells you to go to the next tweet or create a thread. That's the type of application we'll be building today. So with no further ado, let's quickly jump into that and see how it works. So right here I had prepared some HTML and some basic CSS, but that is not our focus today. Today we are focused on the JavaScript. So to start this, I'll say constant, and here all I'm going to do is to get that input. Okay, input equal document. We're going to manipulate the DOM, and I'll say query selector, and inside here I'm going to select the ID of input, not like this but this way, my bad. So I'm going to select the ID of input, and this ID is right here on my input. Okay, as you can see it, I have the ID of input, and here on my on my div, my surrounding div, I have the class of input. So now on this input, all I'm going to do is to select that. Next, I'm going to select this span here, because here this will be updating each time we type something. So I had put a span on this 0 so that it keeps on updating using JavaScript, and I had given it a class of span. So all I'm going to do is say constant count. Const count this way is going to be equal to document dot query selector, and I'm going to select that count dot count this way dot count. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is to add an event listener so that we listen to each change of input. Okay, so to do that, I'll call my input and I'll say add event listener, and that event listener is going to be the input. Okay, so that we listen to the input on that input field, and as you can see, this is an input field of type of text. All right, so all I'm going to do is to create a function here. I'll create a function, and first thing I'm going to do is to get the input length. Okay, and how am I going to get the input length? The input length is going to be equal to the input, and remember that input will hold a value, so I'll say input dot value dot, or not value but just value, like this. Oh, my bad, give me a second. And this is going to be value, just like that, and I'll say dot length. Okay, so that I get the length of that input. So what I'm going to do next is to say count, because remember I have to update a count whenever the input changes. So I'll say count dot inner HTML, or we may say just text content to make it simple, and the text content is going to be the input length. All right, so after doing that, all we are going to do next is to go to our browser and try to see what is happening there. So right here, all I'm going to do, and I'll start by refreshing. So if I type in something, let's check if that will update. So let me say JavaScript, JavaScript is awesome. And as you can see, this keeps on updating, so we have 0, 1 up to 20. But now there is something that I'm not understanding, because check here, we have 0 letters, but when I start typing right here, that word letters disappear, and I don't want that. So let me go back to my code and change that. So what I'm going to do here is to check what I did wrong here, and here we have count. So let me go back here and check. Okay, so instead of saying the whole count should update, all I'm going to do is to update the span of class span. Okay, so now here, instead of count, this is going to be span like this. So after doing that modification, let me try to check if that works. So if I come here, I refresh, we get 0 letters. As soon as I start typing, glad, we have 4 letters, and that is basically what we want, counting the letters on each input. I mean, whenever I change something, if I continue to type, you see they keep on updating. But now, for the purpose of the user experience, there is something we should look at. Let me just put in, empty spaces. Now you see, empty spaces are being counted as letters, and we don't want that. Alright, so now to solve this problem, what I can do so that we don't count the empty spaces is to go back to my code, and what I'm going to do here is to say, here where I get the input value, I'll first trim. There is a method called trim, and basically trim removes all the empty spaces around a word, right? So now the value you're going to get, if it's an empty, if the value contains only empty spaces, after trimming that, we won't get, the length will be 0, because we have removed all those empty spaces, and that will prevent us from counting all the empty spaces. Alright, so now let me give that a try and see if it works in practice. So if I go back here, all I'm going to try is to put in empty spaces. Now, as you can tell, when I put in empty spaces, you see 0 letters. And as soon as I type in something, as you can tell, we now get letter counted, and we have 10 letters. If you count those letters, they are 10 letters. Alright, and that is basically how you create a word counter in JavaScript. Only some lines of code and you're good to go. So let's check our code base, and as you can see, in less than 10 lines, we have been able to capture the user input, trim it, and count the numbers, and count the number of letters inside of the user input. And that's basically it. I can tell we are done with today's build, because we have done what we were supposed to do, and that is taking the user input. After taking the user input, we were able to trim the user input and get the value of the user input displayed to the screen. So guys, thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.